Good morning, how are you? I want to talk to you today and tell you a little story about a sheep that was on my friend's farm in New Zealand. And it's the sheep displayed some behaviour that I've noticed quite a few people displaying. And see if you can recognise the behaviour of either yourself or your friends in this. And if you can, and you want to stop that sort of behaviour, then again, I can recommend to you the life skills class that is run by the Red Cross, Chinese Red Cross in Beijing, and is taught at many universities. Anyway, this story is called The Sheep That Ignored the Call of His Mistress. It was a crisp autumn morning in late April. The sun had not long peeped over the shoulders of the mountains and shone full upon the three sheer triangular rock faces of those known to the locals of the Mara as the Three Kings. Amazing mountains, kings among mountains, and it was executing sparkling, prancing steps on the frosty grass outside the door of the sheep shearers' quarters. Now the bleat of sheep, the bark of dogs, and the shrill whistles from the shepherd disturbed the tranquillity of the early morning. Up on the shoulder of the hill, about a quarter of a mile away, I could see the long, low farmhouse where Pauline and George Wardle live with their family. Here I was staying on land that my father had helped to farm over 60 years ago when he'd emigrated to New Zealand as a young boy of 14. As I looked towards the gate which guarded the entrance to the sheep shearers' quarters, I saw Pauline appear, warmly dressed in trousers, woolly jumper and Wellington boots, and she had bought a pair of wellies for me to wear. "Let's see what George is doing," she called. We strolled towards the sheep sheds, where George and his shepherd were busily engaged in giving each of their year-old lambs a good dose of medicine to keep them from getting scours. Now, scours is a disease that sheep get. We watched for a while as the sheep were let in one by one. George grabbed them, held them firmly between his knees, prized open their reluctant mouths, and squirted the medicine into the back of their mouths, making sure it hit the right spot to trickle down the reluctant throats. All the while the sheep were bleating, the dogs were barking, running around, obeying sharp whistles from the shepherd, leaping over the 4 feet fences, running over the backs of the sheep in order to target the one they needed to target, and generally making sure the sheep went where they were supposed to go. "Come and meet Mats," Pauline invited. "He's our pet ram." As we wandered over to the holding yard, Pauline explained that her youngest son had disobeyed his father and picked up Mats very shortly after he was born. As a result, the lamb's mother had rejected him, not recognising his smell anymore. So he'd had to be hand-reared on the bottle and had adopted the Wardle family as his family. He had become the family pet. But like all other sheep, he had to have the same treatments as they. When he'd started to be destructive and eat Pauline's garden, he'd been returned to the fields and the mountainsides. But whenever the family appeared and called his name, he would usually come and say hello. He knew their voices and usually obeyed instantly. Climbing on the gate, Pauline called out, "Mats, Mats!" But no yearling ram came running over to see us. Pauline called again and again, but he did not come, and there was no answering bar. She went to look in another pen and called out. No Mats came to greet her. Then she went over to the shepherd and asked him where Mats was. "He's there all right," replied the shepherd, "in amongst a load of ewes over in that pen." And he pointed to one of the pens where Pauline had stood and called to Mats. She called again and then let out a cry. "There he is." Mats had raised his head and looked at her. He let out a very masculine sounding "bah" to acknowledge that she was there, and then continued to frisk around with his lady friends, choosing to ignore the well-loved voice of his mistress. He had other things on his mind, having a really good time with his admiring fan club. As I thought about Mats and his behaviour towards Pauline when he was with his fan club, I thought, how like humans that behavior was. It reminded me of the story of Samson that the Jewish people tell, who, in spite of his upbringing, decided to ignore the advice of his parents and, what's worse, the voice of the God of Israel. God had called to him to do a specific job. He had acknowledged God just as Matt had acknowledged Pauline, yet he decided the company of his wild lady friends, including Delilah, was far more enjoyable. And in the end, it led to great suffering for him and his ultimate destruction. You can read his story in the Torah, Judges chapters 12, 13, and 14. But Samson's story is happening around us all today. Many people know what's right and what's wrong. Many people ignore the voice of their parents. Just as Matt heard Pauline and Samson heard God, they ignore. Once they walk closely with their parents, with their family, but the lure of bright lights and excitement led them away from a life of true meaning and happiness to a life of indulgence and self-gratification, constantly looking for the next thing to amuse them. So an empty life with a deep-seated feeling of emptiness and lack of self-worth. If you have that, then I suggest you do something about it. You can choose to ignore what I am saying, or you can choose to do something about it. And if you're religious, you can choose to listen to the voice of God, the acceptor of repentance, calling you and obey his voice. If you're not religious, you can try and go on a course to see how you can sort out your life and become mindful. Okay, well, I hope that's helped you to identify some behaviours that I've actually identified in people around me, and especially in young people. And, you know, the family is so important when it comes to children and to the way children behave. And also, knowing yourself is very important. And as I said before, I cannot recommend the life skills course more highly than I already have. So if we are to turn this world around, we have to be far more mindful than what we are now. All right, then, take care. I hope that's helped you. Take care. Bye.